This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this episode 909 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the questions this week, I want to send another reminder about a new Underdog Fantasy offer. If you sign up on Underdog Fantasy with promo code LATEROUND and then you make a deposit, you'll get a deposit bonus and a link. Underdog will email you a link to my rest of season rankings. Underdog is the best and easiest place to play fantasy sports. There's a lot to play. There's a lot to do on their platform. So check it out, underdogfantasy.com, and make sure you use promo code LATEROUND when you sign up. The first mailbag question this week is from Patreon. It's from Jacob. It says, how do you go about buying the players that you mentioned on your 15 transactions episode? Meaning, how do you come up with trades to get the players you mention as buys? I feel like it's necessary to talk about trading at least once on this show per year. This is that one time. People go about trading in fantasy football the wrong way. They think about players that they want to target instead of thinking about taking advantage of the teams in their league. Like, yeah, I do the 50 transactions episode. I give buy and sell recommendations because it's hopefully good information to have. Maybe you have one of those players on your team, and then you know not to panic if they're a buy. Maybe you have one of those players who are sells and you can sell high. You can try to trade them away. But when it comes to targeting players, yes, I'll see what's going on with the team in my league who has a certain player who I call out as a buy. But I don't always make a trade offer with that team. Because the number one thing to focus on when making a trade in fantasy football is team needs. That's it. Like earlier this week, I said, go buy Amari Cooper. Okay, great. Your team needs wide receiver help. Go ahead, get Amari Cooper. You go and you look at the team that has Amari Cooper, and you realize that they need wide receiver help too. If you're unable to give that team what it needs, it's going to be difficult getting a deal done. It's going to be hard getting Amari Cooper off of their team. What works better is when that team has a lot of good wide receivers, and maybe they lack at running back, but maybe you have a ton of running backs. Or maybe that team just needs some depth, so you can do a 2-for-1 deal. So you can create trades around that, around needs. So when I say that you need to take advantage of teams in your league, I mean you need to focus on their needs. And you also need to take advantage when they're vulnerable. After week 1 in my more active leagues, I'll look at the bottom of the league standings and try to trade with those teams. Because people panic way too much after week 1. And I know that those league managers, they're way more vulnerable and they're ready to make a move versus a team that's in first place. I tweeted about this earlier in the week, but I also think that people need to stop the same position for same position trades. Like Bijan Robinson for Breece Hall. Why? Why are we making that trade? The result of that trade is that there's going to be a clear loser. One of those two running backs will win out. They'll outscore the other one. And maybe you're cool with that. That's fine. But when players are in the same tier like that, we know there's plenty of variance. And we know that fantasy football is about probabilities, not certainties. It's just silly to me to have so much conviction with one player or another in that example. Now, sometimes you will. Sometimes a deal like that, it can be done. But most of the time, you're just swapping coin flips. To me, trades are about making both teams better when the deal is struck. Yes, there could be a loser when it's all said and done. But both teams can absolutely win when different positions are involved. And when you're filling needs for both rosters. Look, I could go on and on and on about this topic. Because in my opinion, it's one of the most misunderstood topics in this game. People need to think more creatively about their deals. That could be giving away more players on your bench in order to improve your starting lineup. Or it's actually just giving their trade partners what those teams need. There's a lot to trading that's just not discussed enough. This next question is also from Patreon. It's from James. It says, hey JJ, is it already time to give up on Blake Corum in a 10-man league? Available backs include Alexander Madison, Jaleel McLaughlin, and Chuba Hubbard. So I'm using this as an opportunity to just talk about moving on from players. I got other questions, like one from Clark on Patreon this week, where it said something along the lines of, when do you move on from late round dart throws? there's no magical number to focus on here. Like, I really wish I could sit back and say, after week 3, if there's no production, you can move on. That's unfortunately just not how this works. Every player circumstance is unique. And also, every lineup is unique. I think that last part is really important to get across. James is asking a question here about Blake Corum. Well, based on the evidence that we have after week 1, Korum currently looks like a handcuff. He didn't get any work. I think that could very easily change in the coming weeks, but the information we have right now, we'd probably lean more in the handcuff direction for Korum than the direction of he's got some value to be a flex play, but then there's the upside with a Kyren Williams injury. Most running backs on your bench sort of fit a category of purely being a handcuff, like Braylon Allen on the Jets, or being more of a flex producer, like Jaleel McLaughlin. Chances are, McLaughlin's not going to be some massive bell cow running back who's going to finish as an RB1 in any format. And that's coming from someone who touted McLaughlin all offseason, but that was known when I was touting him. Justice Hill is another one. Like, what are the odds that he's an every down back even if Derrick Henry goes down? He would definitely see a value bump, but he probably wouldn't be an RB1. Blake Corum, Zach Charbonnet, those guys are not in the same camp. They're getting less work, or hypothetically they're getting less work. But they could see a ton of work if there are injuries to the guys listed ahead of them on the depth chart. What that means is that you have to decide which running back archetype works best for your individual team. If you went 0 RB and you're struggling for some early season points from the position, then you might lean towards Justice Hill over Blake Corum. But there are leagues where a player like Korum is definitely more attractive. And when it comes to just totally giving up on these players, you guys, you have to be more patient than feeling this way after 1 week. A lot of these guys are rookies. Remember what I always say, rookies tend to really overperform during the second half of the season. We do this every single year. You have to be patient with these younger players. Even guys in more ambiguous backfields like a Chase Brown. I got a lot of Chase Brown questions this week. Yes, the usage was really disappointing, but we can't just assume that that usage is going to be the same way all season long, especially with how atrocious the Bengals offense looked. You have to be patient. Patience often wins fantasy championships. Now, speaking of ambiguous backfields, I got this one from @JustDrewIt on Twitter this week that says, only 1 week, but early on, I think I drafted the wrong backs in ambiguous backfields. I went after Spears and Brown when the lead backs might be Pollard and Moss. How should I adjust? Should I hold both? Try to trade for one of Pollard or Moss? So yeah, this is going to happen with ambiguous backfields. Sometimes you get the right guy, sometimes you get the wrong guy. I think we have to keep a couple of things in mind here though. First, we don't know for sure how these backfields are going to actually shake out. Second, part of the allure with ambiguous backfields is the fact that even the 1B in that backfield, they can sometimes be usable, and then they also have the contingent upside if the 1A in that backfield gets hurt. Nailing the player in one of these backfields is never going to be easy. Like, we'll have our favorites from a cost perspective. But as I said all offseason, if you're playing in a decent number of leagues, even just like 3 or 4 of them, it's not smart to just pile all of your exposure to one side of that backfield. Like, I like Tajay Spears at cost more than Tony Pollard at cost. But I have plenty of Tony Pollard on my rosters because it could go either way. And the research, it clearly shows that those are the backfields to target. Now, I know not everyone's playing in more than 1 or 2 leagues. In those cases, yeah, you might lose out on that pick. You might have picked the wrong running back. But at the very least, like I said, that 1B player can still be useful. Tajay Spears' usage in week 1 was not atrocious. He's definitely their receiving back. And the Bengals offense, like I said, they could absolutely change things up because their performance was so bad. Now, the idea of trading for an entire backfield, please do not do that. Remember, ambiguous backfields, these backs who are middle round picks with teammates who are also drafted near them, they're the best kind of running backs to select in that range. But the most likely outcome for an ambiguous backfield is that that backfield is split up. So by capturing both players, all you're doing is giving yourself a headache every single week. Players will end up emerging. And right now, Pollard and Moss look like the early favorites, without a doubt. But we're already hearing Brian Callahan talking about getting Tajay Spears more involved. And the Bengals offense, like I said, for a third time, they weren't good in week 1. This isn't saying that I would prefer Chase over Moss or Spears over Pollard. But now is not the time to just say, how week 1 went down, that's how it's going to be all season long. Especially when you consider that injuries are going to happen. This next question is from Twitter. It's from @AaronShort1188. With your optimism on Jameson Williams, should I be at all concerned with Amon-Ra St. Brown possibly regressing maybe more than anticipated? Is he a potential sell candidate? Okay, so on the 10 Trends episode, I talked about buying into Jameson Williams. Because at this moment, every site that I know that does rest of season rankings, they're just too low on Jameson Williams. I don't want to fully reiterate what's already been said, so I'll just leave it at that. Let's say you're like me and you say to yourself, Jameson Williams is undervalued. He's going to maybe not maintain what he did in week 1, but he's going to have a pretty significant role in this Lions offense. Okay, if that happens, what would happen to the other players in that offense? Amon-Ra St. Brown might take a slight hit. Same with Sam Laporta. I say slight though, because number 1, Williams is not going to maintain his target share that he saw in week 1. But number 2, Williams can capture a 20% target share in this offense while Laporta and St. Brown still eat. Just think of it this way. Last year, Detroit wide receivers saw a 58% target share in that offense. The year before that, it was 62%. Those are pretty normal rates. Last season, we were seeing about a 20% target share in Detroit's offense going to wide receivers not named Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams. Williams' per game rate was about 10%. And this is just quick math. So in order for St. Brown and Laporta to just kind of maintain their roles, Williams could see an uptick while the secondary players on the Lions, they would get bumped down. And I think that's what's going to happen. In week 1, Williams ran around on 94% of Detroit's dropbacks. Then it was Khalif Raymond at 72%. No other wide receiver aside from Amon-Ra St. Brown was above 13%. The targets are now just looking to be distributed in a more funneled way, just based off of week 1. Last year, Williams ran around on 56% of Detroit's dropbacks. Again, it was 94% in week 1. So to me, Amon-Ra St. Brown, his target share year over year, it might drop by 1 or 2 percentage points, maybe 3. It could have a small impact. Maybe. I don't think that's a lock. Because like I said, the distribution of targets in the Lions offense could just be more narrow. We also need to think about this in terms of range of outcomes and in terms of what the market might think. Like Jameson Williams' season, it could still go south. We don't need to be locked into some take that he's absolutely arrived. We don't know yet. We're just looking at week 1, seeing his awesome peripherals, looking at him as a player, as a prospect, and we're saying, man, if it finally clicked for Jameson Williams, then he could be a massive value right now. If the take was that he's absolutely arrived, that he's here, that we're going to see Jameson Williams be the player we thought he might be coming out of Alabama, if that were the case, he'd be ranked more in wide receiver 2 range. There's still an outcome here where nothing changes year over year. So sometimes if the market is reacting too much to that week 1 game, you can then go in the opposite direction. And you could say, go get Amon-Ra St. Brown. I'm saying that St. Brown is still fine. Laporta was a regression candidate anyway. But I like buying into Williams right now because based off of the stuff that I've seen, people aren't reacting enough to him in week 1. If it's wrong, so be it. You're only paying a wide receiver 4 price tag. That's really not significant for a player who we all thought was once very good and who then showed up in week 1. That's why he's a wide receiver 3 in my rankings right now. The next question is from The Wasted Picks. It says, I am concerned about the usage of Chris Olave. I don't see how a legitimate number 1 receiver gets 2 for 14 in any game, regardless of game script, especially when the team puts up 40 plus points. Either we are all wrong and Olave's bad, or it will never happen with Allen as coach or Carr at quarterback. If the expectation is that Chris Olave is like Justin Jefferson, or if that's your definition of a legit number 1 receiver, then yes, I agree. Olave will almost definitely not make a Justin Jefferson-like impact in fantasy football. But how many guys are truly going to make that impact? You can probably count them on one hand. Players are going to have down games statistically. And everyone keeps referencing this 40-plus point thing. The Saints completed 19 passes in that game against Carolina. Yes, Chris Olave, he could have been more involved in that offense. I just said that he had a down game. But Derek Carr threw for 200 yards. 59 of those yards came on one single play. The defense just put them in awesome positions, and they weren't really asked to do that much through the air. Game script does matter. It's at least part of the equation here. As I said on the 10 Trends episode, I'm continuing to be more optimistic than most about this Saints offense because of their use of motion in week 1 and their use of play action. Olave was one of the best wideouts in football last year when put in motion. The Saints offense was just horrific. And I mean that schematically. The idea of either we are all wrong and Olave is bad, that's insane to me. He's been in the league for 2 years now. He's finished as a top 25 wide receiver in PPR points per game in both of those seasons, and an absolutely ridiculously bad offensive scheme. His yards per route run in those 2 seasons, 2.07 and 2.42. Here's a list of all the wide receivers since 2011 who ran at least 300 routes in year 1 and year 2, who had yards per route run rates in both seasons above 2. And keep in mind, Olave's been well over that mark. Here's that list. Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, A.J. Brown, Juju Smith-Schuster, Michael Thomas, Odell Beckham, Mike Evans, Julio Jones, and A.J. Green. That's like all pro player after all pro player and then Juju Smith-Schuster. But Juju's nothing like Chris Olave as a receiver. He's a totally different archetype. Chris Olave is a good player. He's a great player. He's a talented player. And while he's not part of the top 3 elite wide receivers in the game, I would be shocked if we're looking back on this season, and I'm not talking about week 2 or week 3 and overreacting over bad stat lines early in the season or in small sample sizes. I would be shocked at the end of the year if Chris Olave had a bad season. The last question this week, it's not football related, but people ask for these questions sometimes on the show, so I'm going to answer this one because I'm pretty passionate about it. It's from Michael on Patreon, and it says, "Hey JJ, love the show. Thanks. Non-fantasy question here. Your graphics in the offseason and draft guides are awesome. Even the podcast feed images and the website layout. Do you have someone that does graphic design for you, or are you super talented at that too? Keep up the awesome work." So one of my sincere passions since I was like 11 years old has been design. I taught myself graphic design when I was in middle school. That then led to me learning some front-end development. Like when I was in high school, people were doing their high school jobs. They were working at like McDonald's and stuff. But I was building websites for people. Usually just small businesses where I'd get like $500. But that was a lot of money when you were a junior in high school. When I graduated high school, I was like 50-50 on what I wanted to study. I almost went to the University of Cincinnati to study graphic design. But I decided to get my degree in marketing because I felt like if I wanted to be a designer, I could figure it out on my own. Anyway, all that's to say that design and branding has always been incredibly top of mind for me. I did internships in college where I did a lot of design work. Now fast forward out of school when I graduated from Pitt and I went into the advertising world. I knew front-end development, I knew graphic design, and I had a degree in marketing. So I was bringing all of those worlds together. Now I didn't get a lot out of my 2 jobs out of school, which led me to writing the Late Round Quarterback ebook. And that turned into the career that I have now. But when I was at one of those 2 agencies that I worked for, I worked with someone who became a friend. It was a marketing agency and it was a really cool spot with a really awesome owner. I worked with great people. We had a ping pong table. I brought in my Sega. We would play NHL 94 almost every single day together. And we would always talk about just our general dream jobs. He wanted to do his own thing. He wanted his own design shop. I wanted to be a fantasy football analyst. We were 23 years old at the time. Fast forward 13 years, I'm sitting here right now in front of a microphone living my dream. And he's got an awesome branding studio that he now owns with his wife. And he's been my backbone with all things design. I went like a decade without doing much at all with graphic and web design. I started all this fantasy football stuff. I worked at NumberFire and FanDuel. I wasn't asked to do that kind of work. But when I went out on my own a few years ago and I started late round fantasy football, part of the allure for me in doing that was that I'd get to do some of that creative work again. And I'm not good enough these days to create the designs that you see in the guides each year. My buddy does that. But I love having the assets that he's created and being able to use them for smaller things. Like anything you see on the website, I created and coded that website. I do the YouTube thumbnails, stuff like that. But it's all built from the design and branding foundation that my friend built for me. And shout out to Rich Ryan as well, who co-hosted Becoming a Best Ball Bro with me. He does all of the video work that you see out there on social media platforms. But my buddy's branding studio, it's called Edelmade. Like I said, it's a smaller shop. He and his wife own it. If you need anything done, absolutely hit them up. They do amazing work, of course, but they're also amazing people. It's edelmade.com, edelmade.com. That's my story, though. Design matters a lot to me. I brought that up a bit last week when I talked to Jason Moore on Late Round Perspectives. I wish I had more time for it, but at least you have a little bit more background on why things look the way that they do. And you saying that about the guides and about the brand, it means more to me than you could even imagine. Because like I said, it's been a passion of mine for the majority of my life. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. There's a Late Round Perspectives episode dropping later this morning. Go check that out. Otherwise, everyone, good luck in week 2. I'll talk to you next week.